Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen. I'm here with London Paul. And Paul, it's quite fascinating that China is now taking a page out of Russia's handbook. And by that, I mean tit for tat when it comes to economic policies and global trade. In particular, there was a components that are being sourced from Chinese suppliers for a drone company, and China has decided to cut that off at the knees. Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for stopping by and getting your insight. And there's a lot that's going on with China. They're finally starting to stand up to the West when it comes to commerce, trade, and fair practices.
Yeah, well, firstly, Ken, thanks for joining me as well as ever. Greatly appreciated. Now, yeah, this really is how effectively the Chinese are now sticking it to the West in a major way. And this is not where it used to be a situation where, for example, we had the situation with Huawei and they then, necessity is the mother of invention. So they go out of their way to adapt the business so they can evolve their way past the challenges they face in effectively sanctioning China. And we've seen that obviously in the semiconductor industry as well, where China is becoming self sufficient. This is more to do with arguably targeting certain companies or certain industrial sectors or targeting certain countries based on them making policy decisions which are detrimental to China's best own interests. So, very clearly, the United States is part of that problem. It has been since the Trump administration days when they had the completely failed tariff war. Effectively, it just backfired on the United States very badly. And it comes back to this point that's worth reiterating. Tariffs are not paid by the Chinese on Chinese goods exported to the United States. It's the US consumer who foots the bill, and that tax revenue is then absorbed by the government and should be spent in a profitable way. And of course, it's not. It's just part of trying to plug the gap on the enormous fiscal deficit that exists inside the US. And that's still commonly misunderstood, particularly, dare I say it, amongst Trump supporters who think everything Trump says is a great idea. So we're sticking it to the Chinese. No, you're having it stuck to yourself. And of course, it's highly inflationary in the process. But when Ken made reference to a US drone manufacturer, and it's worth noting this company's called Skydio, I think, and they're the
Correct.
largest US drone manufacturer. Now, not so long ago, it announced that effectively it was going to have to ration batteries for its customers because of supply constraints implemented by Chinese government sanctions. So they said the battery supply would be reduced for the next few months because of these sanctions, as batteries were obviously one of the few components the company was still sourcing from China. Okay, probably now we'll look to do something different, but to deal with this supply chain problem, they'd then have to ration batteries to one per drone. And obviously, the company would then have to take some measures to support and these companies because of this to compensate for this deficiency, and that would deal with warranties for drones delivered with less than this full complement of batteries. So good on the company trying to address this problem. Now, the company came out and said China sanctioned their company for selling drones to Taiwan, where they actually said, well, the only customer we have is the Taiwanese National Fire Agency. Now, arguably fair enough. I mean, it's a fire agency. They're hardly going to be drones used for military purposes. But the argument, I suppose, the Chinese are saying, well, the Taiwanese could commandeer those in the future for military purposes. Well, maybe they could, maybe they couldn't. Now, the argument is, and from the company's perspective, is China really effectively just picking on the company and going, we're going to eliminate the US's biggest drone company, and also in the process then try and get China to take a more dominant position on people buying Chinese drones. It's an argument that's a valid one. And ironically, of course, Skydio is not the only American company sanctioned by the Chinese. There was the military shipbuilder Huntington, which was sanctioned, also the military drone company Edge Autonomy. So China's now making inroads to try and target specific companies. And okay, from there, they may feel it's legitimate, but the argument could be this is just tit for tat. And China's now going, well, if you're going to screw with the Chinese companies, we're going to start to try and make life difficult to whatever extent that is. And we can't say for US companies. Now, of course, in terms of the announcement of the sanctions, the Chinese government or foreign ministry came out and made reference to the US government's announcement of substantial military assistance to Taiwan. Okay, and of course, China regards Taiwan as part of its territory, and they said the company's movable and immovable properties and other kind of assets within China should be frozen because of the sanctions. So this is clearly a change of policy from Beijing. The argument is they could extend this across multiple sectors to multiple companies and make life very difficult, whether it's in the short term, the medium term, or the long term is debatable. Obviously, Skydio regards it as a short-term problem, but still it's a problem. And there is also arguments to suggest that because certain companies could also be working and operating with the Ukrainians, this might be also why China is deciding to implement these measures. It's in part to support the Russians. I tend not to believe that's the case. I think China's position's been pretty neutral. We're not getting involved in those kind of tit-for-tat sanctions, but I think their perspective is, well, if anything gets exported to Taiwan, we're not going to listen to legitimate concerns. As far as we're concerned, they could be utilized by the Taiwanese government because the US position has been, well, fairly hostile in inverted commas towards China by providing arms, etc., to the Taiwanese. Now, what's very telling on the back of all this is the world's largest drone maker, which is DJI, which is obviously has filed a lawsuit against the US DoD because it was designated as a Chinese military company by the Americans. Now, again, this is this the reason why China's now gone after, obviously, the drone manufacturer Skydio in the US? It could well be true. And DJI argued that it neither owned nor was controlled by the Chinese military, and that the Pentagon's behaving in an unlawful manner. And they've argued because of this they lost business, and because it's being basically referred to as a military company, therefore it could pose national security threat if they sold those drones to other companies. And now, of course, the blacklisting of that company in China could be linked to China's sanctions against Skydio. It's very likely just tit for tat, going, well, if you're going to do it to us, we'll do it to you. But this is really basically the thin end of the wedge. And I'll stop there because then we'll come on to China and tariffs on European goods and problems there, because that's an enormous problem also. But the question is this China's new stance where if you're going to try and impact us, we're going to impact you? And of course, you've got to also set this against the fact that China has enormous, well, not so quite enormous, hundreds of billions of dollars of US treasuries. It's also clearly, whenever it gets treasuries, it's dumping them and buying gold. It can cause the United States a lot of financial damage also in the process. So the US needs to be extremely careful in how it flexes its muscles and makes these statements, because in the end, this is another example where it, to a larger or lesser extent, it can be damaging to US companies in the process.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting. This is starting to come up with, the potential, the expectation, say what you will, of a Trump administration who, in during his time 4 years ago, implemented tariffs against China for a number of their goods. Well, of course, his rhetoric is that he's going to do it en masse, not just for China, but also Europe, in the hopes of getting U.S. companies back competitive, providing much of the goods that we import to be done domestically, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm not going to get into the economic ramifications, consequences, or pros and cons of doing that, but the reality is that not only does the U.S. rely so much on foreign imports for just sustaining our way of life, but many of our corporations, going back to 1996 and NAFTA, have offshored themselves into the cheaper labor of Vietnam, India, Taiwan, China, etc. So, besides the fact that you have these, China imposing sanctions, tariffs, or whatever, or even outright not shipping things in the same tit for tat that the U.S. is not allowing Huawei phones. Europe, in many ways, was not allowing Chinese EVs. You have, in the case of chips, not allowing China to get the high-end chips, et cetera, et cetera. Well, obviously, they're in the real world, not the rules-based world that the United States and the hegemonic world that they live in. Nations are going to impose whatever they need to protect themselves. Now, they might, in the end, want integral commerce, i.e., what the BRICS are doing, free trade without these type of sanctions, without these types of tariffs, without worrying about the political or social, nuances of what a nation does or between two nations. But in the end, the U.S. is now trying to continue functioning in the old way. Europe the same, which you're going to talk about here in just a moment. And China is left with the decision of, are they going to allow themselves to simply be run roughshod? Maybe 10, 15 years ago, when they were in a lesser position, they could do that. Now, guess what? They are the number one economy in the world. Forget all the BS about GDP. GDP in the US is garbage. Consumer spending is not productivity. China is about productivity. India is about productivity. Vietnam and many in the South China Sea and the global South is about productivity. They have the goods, and as such, they're going to go ahead and designate and make the rules on how these things are going to be done. And if the U.S. is going to impose threats like what they've done with Taiwan, well, China can very easily, because many of these U.S. companies are in China, they can very easily cut them off at the knees and, one, not facilitate the supply chain to the U.S. And then what is the United States going to do? Well, as we've shown with many, the trillions of dollars that's been passed for all these infrastructure bills and EV and all that, the U.S. can't produce anything now. They don't have the fortitude or mindset to be able to do that. Are they going to be able to turn that on and off like a light switch if Trump gets in there? Honestly, I don't think so. We don't have the labor force that has the dedication and the fortitude that we did in the 1950s, 1960s. So China is really, they don't want to do it necessarily, but they're no longer going to be, treated as a redheaded stepchild and doing the US's bidding. China is going to start acting, in my opinion, as they are the ones that have the goods, and you're going to come on our terms on what you need and what we're going to facilitate for you.
Well, yeah, but most importantly, the US can sit there and claim it's going to reindustrialize its country, but if a widget costs $1 and you buy it from China, it's going to cost $5, $6 in the US. That is not sustainable. That creates massive inflation in the US, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. People will want higher wages, which creates more price inflation, and the US is then not only going to have a totally uncompetitive domestic market, but also no one's going to buy the stuff from the US anyway, because they'll go, well, I can go to China and get it for $1. Why am I going to pay 5 times as much to buy it from you? So that in of itself is just a very simple explanation why the US reindustrializing is a myth, is an illusion. It's not reality. But setting that aside, coming back to the issue of Europe, there's a very good example of this, and this was actually caused by the United States, because the US saw how China was taking a stranglehold on the electric vehicle market. Why? Because again, they can produce vehicles cheaper, they can sell them a lot cheaper. So the United States looked at this and tried to effectively cajole, stroke bully the European nations to go, well, you're going to have to put tariffs on these vehicles to make them less competitive. Because remember all the silly statements coming out from the US and Europe about overcapacity and how China was subsidizing all their electric vehicle businesses, which ironically they're not doing in any way, shape, or form. And there's recent evidence that proves that categorically. So what happened is Europe then kind of got browbeaten by the European Commission, which means Washington, to put tariffs. So they had a vote on this. Now, of course, a number of countries voted for it and a number voted against it. But this had ramifications, because at first China sat there and went, well, if you're going to put 50% tariffs, France, on our electric vehicles, well, guess what? We're going to put tariffs on goods you ship to us. How does that grab you? And they kind of weren't very happy, because they think we should be able to do what we want to you, China, and you don't have any recourse. Then the panic set in inside Europe when China came out and went and told its automakers to stop investing in European countries that voted for additional EV tariffs against China. And all of a sudden, they wanted to go and have talks with the Chinese and let's find a solution to this problem. Why do they say this? Because all the countries concerned, I think there was somewhere like 10, maybe 10 or 11 EU countries. France were one of them. And Italy, I think Poland and numerous others. If China was to stop investing, this would be to the tune of tens of billions of euros in foreign direct investment. It would also cause a huge impact on employment opportunities. Huge amounts of jobs would be lost. And also, basically, what it would mean is these countries would struggle hugely to develop their own electric vehicle industry in the process, because they are lagging behind the Chinese. Now, the reason, of course, why a lot of these countries voted for the tariffs, apart from trying to be ever so friendly and dutiful to the United States, is because they were, in some stupid reasoning, came to the conclusion that actually this will help us develop our own industry. And because if we're putting tariffs on China, people won't buy Chinese vehicles, so they'll have to buy vehicles from us. But ironically, of course, those that have voted for the tariffs are now likely to be penalized heavily, whereas those who voted against the tariffs, well, obviously, I think the Chinese will go, well, we'll invest in your country. So they will benefit by not voting through a measure. But everybody knows, including the Chinese, that this was the United States behind this move. And this is not the first time. You mentioned, and we talked about it previously and earlier on, about the US trying to put export controls on semiconductors sent to China to try and destroy China's capability to produce semiconductors or have access to them because they thought it would cripple their technology, while China's just developing its own semiconductor industry in ways that has blown the minds of Washington and Europe. They thought it would take them decades. Well, they've done it in 1 or 2 years. So that blew up in the face. But there's been other precedents in history with the US trying to, in a way, try and stymie China's technological progress. It happened with the solar panel sector probably 10 years or so ago, roughly. And all it did is China's gone from strength to strength, and it seriously impacted the US's solar industry and capabilities itself. So the US never learns the lessons of its own mistakes. Now it repeatedly does it for semiconductors, does it for the solar industry, does it for EVs, and Europe's now suddenly panicking, going, hang on, China's been deadly serious. I mean, what could they then start going, well, we'll apply this to other sectors? Because if you look at the EU's trade in goods with China, I think the last full year figures was last year. Of course, they import an awful lot more than they export. To be honest, their exports to China in the last decade have hardly grown, whereas China's have effectively nearly doubled. It dropped a bit between 2022 and 2023, but still, so there's an enormous trade deficit. Well, probably somewhere in the order, I guess, of about 300 billion euros deficit for Europe in its trading goods with China. So China suddenly starts cutting things off or refusing to supply the European Union. The European Union's in big enough trouble with regards to its energy or lack of cheap Russian energy, because if you look back to 2023, China was the third largest partner for EU export of goods, but also the largest partner for EU import of goods. It was over 20%. So the European Union is having to look at this and go, this is way more serious a problem. And people often think, oh, China just exports cheap rubbish to the European Union. Well, it doesn't. It exports things like telecommunications equipment, electrical machinery. They export a lot of electronic tubes, valves, and those kind of components. The electric power machinery, obviously cars, household equipment, electrical apparatus for electrical circuits, manufacturing of base metals, and the list goes on and on. Motor vehicle parts, lighting, heating and cooling equipment. The list goes on. It's not just cheap rubbish, which would have been, cheap domestic household type equipment. It could be toasters, kettles, that kind of thing, or, just toys, or, just generally cheap and, below 100 euros, $100 per item equipment. Yeah, but not anymore. So if China decides to get really aggressive with Europe could be in big trouble. And people say, well, they will never do this. Well, people fail to realize that they think China depends on the United States. Well, it contributes a very small percentage, excuse me, of China's annual GDP, which will surprise a lot of people. But, it's one of these situations where there's a lot of myth about what contributes to China's GDP and what doesn't, and how China's totally dependent on the US, excuse me, which it isn't. And, on that basis, people have to stop questioning when the West says this. And I think part of this was during the Trump administration, where they went, oh, let's make out that China's heavily dependent on its economy. So if we stick tariffs, it'll look like we're really being harsh on China. Well, they weren't in any way, shape, or form. and I think that's something people need to be aware of. Trying to think the exact percentage. I know it's so ridiculously small. Um, and it's probably something like 3 or 4% of their GDP. It's nothing, even though people would think it was 30, 40%. We'll have to look up the exact figure, but it's really pretty small.
Yeah,
Excuse me.
and
Sorry. Go on.
one of
Sorry.
the big things I was going to add, one of the big things that outside of the sanctions and the tariffs of that, the U.S. obviously and Europe have regulated themselves into oblivion. I mean, the cost on manufacturing and on goods from all of their regulatory morass is just mind-boggling. And the fact of the matter is when you have that much, you are not going to get capital from foreign countries to invest in you, in your country, in your businesses. In many ways, labor costs, yes, that was one of the reasons why U.S. and other foreign countries went to East Asia or Southeast Asia, but also the ability to actually put together a company you know, used to take a couple weeks, maybe a month. Now it takes years. So why would you do that when you can go over to China, Vietnam, etc. And it's just the cost of building your factory. There might be a factory that's already there because that's part of their industry. And the one thing I was also going to add, the mindset people have of China when it comes to cheap goods. China in many ways was like Japan. In the 1960s, if you said, Japanese built, you thought of cheap plastic transistor radios. But by the 1980s, you thought of quality that surpassed anything that the United States could come up with or Europe. The same thing with China. In the late 1990s, early 2000s, yeah, it was knockoffs and copies and fake. I remember one of the things during the housing bubble people were, I was talking to construction crews. They were importing drywall, the gypsum for drywall, and it would very quickly get black mold. Well, that was China in the, early to late 90s to early mid 2000s. Now, however, they're building bullet trains that go from Beijing to wherever in an hour. They're building all of these things in these cities. They're not building cheap knockoffs anymore. They're building quality that surpasses anything that the West has. So this is a mindset that people, have to get out of their heads. It's the U.S. and Europe that are building crap plastic. So there's so many things beyond what the sanctions and the inability of the West to manufacture, the ability of China to be superior in manufacturing, that they have to do these tariffs because in the end, China has the quality goods. They can sell to anybody. They don't need, as you mentioned, Europe or the United States. U.S. and Europe desperately need China. So, the more that you uh, you know poke a bear, eventually they're going to turn around, slap you in the face, and then walk away, and you'll lose out on potentially what could benefit you and your people.
Yeah, and just a final point. I went and checked. It is the contribution of uh, exports to the United States to China's GDP annually is about 3.1, 3.2%. So it was, as I thought, it's chicken feed. So China doesn't need the United States as a marketplace. And frankly, the US needs to understand this.
Exactly. So anyway, I think that we covered quite a bit. It's definitely going to be something we're going to address as if a new administration comes in and what they decide to do, if they decide to follow through with their rhetoric about tariffs and sanctions. But until then, we're taking a look at the real world and what China is doing in a tit for tat response. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this great discussion and your insight.
And likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report, thank you for being a part of this community. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, comment, send this out to anybody you think could be important. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.